Hello my friends and family, I want to tell you a story about a man who wore a collar and claimed he spoke for God. He was a pope in a small town that believed him to be pure, righteous, and above reproach. Every Sunday people filled his church to hear him speak about mercy, forgiveness, and the path to salvation. They brought their offerings, their children, their hopes, and he took them smiling in a way that made everyone feel safe. But beneath the calm voice and the gentle face there was darkness, a darkness that had been growing for years unseen and unnoticed. For 10 years he operated in secret while people trusted him with their lives. Behind the walls of his residence he met with men who carried guns and wore masks. They called themselves bandits, but he called them partners. They planned attacks together, and he knew exactly which villages to hit, which homes to raid, and which families to terrorize. He gave them lists of names, families to target, and houses that had money or valuables. He gave instructions that caused people to disappear and others to die quietly at night. He was careful, he was clever, he was untouchable. The police never suspected the man in the collar who preached about mercy. People whispered rumors, but no one dared speak against him. He gave sermons about sin and salvation while outside the walls his own hands guided death and suffering. Money flowed to him secretly in envelopes, in briefcases, in bank accounts no one questioned. Then one day something changed. One of his old partners fell into a trap and the authorities captured him. Under pressure he began to speak. Names, addresses, dates, everything that linked the Pope to crimes people thought impossible. The authorities moved quietly at first, gathering evidence, watching every move. The Pope noticed nothing. He smiled at the congregation, he shook hands, he blessed the sick. And then he said something that made the investigators stop. He said he had handed his own wife and child to the bandits for money. He said he did not resist, he watched as they disappeared and returned empty-handed. He said he justified it with religion, with power, with greed and fear. He said he had sinned beyond measure. He said he was ready to face consequences, but begged them not to execute him, not to let the angry people outside take justice into their own hands. He said he wanted only a jail cell, a place where he could think about what he had done and pay the price for 10 years of deceit and murder. And yet he begged. He begged for mercy for his soul, not for the lives he had destroyed. He confessed with clarity, with precision, with horror. Each name, each death, each family he had betrayed fell from his mouth like stones, crushing his conscience. He wanted the world to know he was guilty, to know the full measure of his sin. He wanted confession to replace vengeance. After the confession, the authorities knew they had a choice to make. The Pope had admitted everything without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no doubt now that the man who had preached mercy and forgiveness had orchestrated pain and death for a decade. Still, they had to handle it carefully. The people outside the station were already gathering. Rumors spread like fire through the town. Some were crying, some were shaking their fists, some whispered curses. Others feared what this revelation meant for the faith they had held sacred all their lives. The investigators questioned him further. They wanted names, they wanted dates, they wanted proof. He gave them everything without hesitation. He did not flinch, he did not lie. Each word was another burden lifted and another weight added. He spoke of midnight raids, of families who had trusted him, of churches burned, of men shot and women stolen. He spoke of the money funneled through secret accounts, of hidden properties, of coded messages he had sent. He spoke of accomplices he had never trusted fully, and how one by one they had fallen into traps he had planned. Meanwhile, the Pope thought of forgiveness. He did not think of God's forgiveness, he thought of human forgiveness. He knew it would not come easily. He knew some would demand justice in blood. He knew others would never forgive him. Still he hoped. He had confessed openly and completely. He had admitted the greatest betrayals. He had admitted handing his wife and child to be killed for money. He had admitted the full measure of his sin. All that remained was to face the law and hope the world still recognized mercy. The next morning the town awoke to news of his arrest. Crowds formed outside the police station. Some shouted demands for immediate execution. Some prayed for his soul. Some simply stared at the car that had carried him there the day before and shook their heads in disbelief. Every eye in town now saw the man as he truly was. Every whisper carried his name and every glance measured him for judgment. He became both a cautionary tale and a living embodiment of evil in human form. Inside the station he reflected on his life. He remembered the first time he had met the bandits, the first time he had accepted the idea of violence for profit. At first it had seemed harmless, small attacks on those he considered wealthy or corrupt. He had convinced himself that God would forgive small sins for a greater good. But soon the crimes escalated. The attacks became personal. The money became more important than anything else. And his soul had decayed in silence. He had smiled at the congregation while planning murder. He had blessed children while plotting death. Then he thought of the wife and child. How easily he had traded them for money. How simple it had seemed at the time. How impossible it seemed now to undo. He could not remember the last time he had felt love or affection. He could only remember calculation, planning, betrayal, and fear. He had lost everything he had ever claimed to hold sacred, and he knew it. He knew that no confession could bring them back. No apology could erase the lives he had destroyed. All that remained was the cold weight of truth and the hope that the law would punish him. The Pope sat alone in a small cell. The walls were bare and cold, and the air smelled faintly of damp and despair. He could hear footsteps and voices outside, but nothing touched him as sharply as the silence inside. Silence forced him to remember. It forced him to see the faces he had destroyed. He could see them clearly now in his mind. The mother who had begged him for mercy, the father who had fallen to his knees and cried, the children who had screamed for their parents. He had caused all of it. Every scream, every tear, every empty home. He remembered the village he had chosen first. He had convinced himself it was justice. They were people of wealth and arrogance, he told himself. They had money and property and he needed the funds. He had smiled as the bandits struck at night. He had felt a thrill when they obeyed his instructions without question. He had thought himself clever and untouchable. And yet he did not remember the screams at first, only the calculations, the steps, the way he had maneuvered the chaos. Then came the day he handed over his own wife and child. He had convinced himself it was necessary for the larger plan. He had told himself the money would secure safety and power. He had watched the bandits take them and he had felt nothing at the moment. Only later did the emptiness settle in. Only later did he understand the magnitude of what he had done. And for 10 years he had hidden that guilt under sermons, smiles, and blessings. He had hidden it so well that not one person suspected. Outside the station the town was restless. People gathered at the gates. Some shouted for execution, some prayed for mercy, some silently wept. Families who had lost loved ones approached with hatred in their eyes. They had heard the confession. They had seen the news. They knew the Pope had caused death and suffering on a scale they had never imagined. The atmosphere was heavy with anger and grief, and the air seemed charged with a threat of violence. Inside he was haunted. The faces of his victims returned night and day. The old woman he had watched disappear under moonlight. The father whose farm he had chosen for robbery. The children who had cried for safety. Every detail came back. Every choice he had made, every lie he had told, every prayer he had spoken while planning murder. The memories did not fade. They would not fade. And he realized fully for the first time that he had destroyed not only others but himself. He began to speak to himself aloud. His voice echoed in the bare cell. He begged for forgiveness but knew it would not come. He cried for mercy but understood that mercy was not owed. He thought of the law and what justice would demand. He thought of people outside and their anger and fear. He thought of his own family and the terrible decision he had made. He understood the full scope of his betrayal, and still he hoped that somehow his confession could soften the world enough to spare his life. The bandits who had once obeyed him now feared him. Some had been caught, others had escaped. They knew he had confessed everything. They had heard his words, and they understood that he had exposed all their crimes. He had been their leader and their betrayer at the same time. And now the law was closing in on them as well. Some sent messages, threatening vengeance. Others begged for protection, all knowing the chain of events would lead to retribution. Then the first families arrived at the station to see him. They were quiet at first, watching him from behind barriers, studying his face. Some were shaking with rage, others with sorrow. Mothers, fathers, siblings, all measuring the man who had claimed holiness and delivered death. The Pope did not flinch. He did not speak. He only looked down, knowing that their eyes were knives, that their judgment was heavier than any sentence the court could deliver. The authorities intervened quickly. They separated the crowd from him, guided families away, controlled the anger with firm voices and careful hands. But even in control, the tension was palpable. The people had lost faith in a figure they once revered. They had lost trust in the church itself. The Pope had shattered everything, and no words could repair the damage. At night, alone in his cell, the Pope thought of his confession. He realized it had been both relief and curse. He had spoken the truth but had exposed himself fully to hate and justice. He thought of the world outside, of the families, of the cries, of the anger. He understood that the next days would determine whether he would live in the shadow of his guilt or meet violent death at the hands of people who wanted revenge. And he knew that no sermon could prepare him for what was coming. The trial date was set quickly. The town buzzed with anticipation and fear. People whispered in markets, in homes, on streets, everywhere. Everyone wanted to see the man who had betrayed his faith and orchestrated death in person. They wanted to hear his voice in a courtroom. Some came with anger burning inside. Others came with curiosity. Few came hoping for answers. Inside the court, the Pope sat quietly in a plain suit. The collar was gone, the robes gone, the symbols of holiness stripped from him. He looked like any other man, yet he carried the weight of 10 years of crimes and betrayals. His hands were folded on the table, eyes fixed on the floor. The prosecutor read aloud the charges one by one, each name, each village, each attack. The courtroom grew silent as the magnitude of his deeds unfolded in precise detail. Families of victims sat in rows, some holding photographs, some with children clinging to their sides. Their faces were tight with anger, eyes filled with grief. They did not shout, they did not cry aloud, yet their presence pressed heavily on him. Every accusation, every story, every photo was a reminder of the life he had stolen, the trust he had destroyed, and the faith he had betrayed. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, the Pope stood. He looked at the crowd at first and then down at the floor. He spoke slowly. He confessed openly to everything, repeating each detail with clarity. He admitted planning attacks, sending orders, handling money, and betraying lives. He admitted handing over his own wife and child. He admitted he had watched them disappear. His voice was steady but low, carrying the weight of guilt and the desire for punishment. People leaned forward. Some shook their heads. Some closed their eyes. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers clenched fists. Children stared in confusion. The room was filled with the sound of sorrow and anger without a single word spoken from the crowd. And yet he continued. He begged the court not to execute him. He begged for the chance to serve a sentence, to live and think of what he had done. He begged for mercy from the world, understanding fully the cruelty of what he had committed, yet hoping that some part of humanity could grant him time to pay his debt. The The defense tried to speak on his behalf. They argued that the full confession showed repentance. They argued that death would not bring justice. They argued that the law was sufficient. Some jurors nodded. Others shook their heads. The families of victims whispered among themselves, some furious, some silent, some shaking with disbelief that any man could confess with such calmness after such atrocities. Each day of the trial brought more stories. Bandits, accomplices, villagers, survivors all testified. The Pope listened quietly, sometimes nodding, sometimes staring blankly. Every story added to his burden. Every detail reminded him of the lives he had destroyed. And in the night when the courtroom was empty, he replayed every confession in his mind. Every scream, every cry, every pleading, every death. He could not escape the images. They were branded into his mind. The press covered the trial with intensity. Newspapers, television, radio, and online platforms carried every detail. His name became synonymous with betrayal and evil. People across the country and even beyond followed each session. Some debated if forgiveness was possible. Others argued that he must never see freedom again. Every day brought more tension, more anger, more fear. The world was watching a man who had once claimed to speak for God now face the full consequence of his own choices. At night he could not sleep. He thought of his life before the crimes, the first day he wore the collar, the smiles, the blessings, the trust he had been given. He remembered every hand he had shaken, every face he had blessed, and now every single one of them carried a shadow of betrayal. The weight of 10 years pressed down on him, heavier than any chain. He realized the prison of his own conscience was already 10 times harsher than the one that awaited him. And still he hoped. Hope was strange in a man like him, guilty beyond measure. Yet he hoped that some part of the world would see his repentance, would grant him the chance to live with the consequences rather than die in anger and vengeance. He knew it was unlikely. He knew the rage outside and the pain inside were unstoppable. But hope was all he had left, fragile as it was, a single thread connecting him to a world he had betrayed. The final day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Families of victims, journalists, citizens from far and near had come to witness the conclusion. The air was heavy with anticipation and tension. No one spoke above a whisper. Every eye was fixed on the man who had once claimed holiness and now faced the consequences of a decade of unimaginable crimes. The judge called the court to order. Silence fell. The prosecutor recounted the crimes once more, emphasizing the betrayal, the murders, the destruction of lives, and the betrayal of his own family. Every word landed with precision. There was no doubt left. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of survivors and accomplices left no space for argument. The Pope rose. His face was pale. He did not speak of justification or excuse. He admitted fully to everything once again, describing each action, each betrayal, each moment he had turned away from mercy and towards greed and violence. He spoke of handing his wife and child to the bandits and the emptiness he had felt, the horror he had ignored, and the lives he had stolen. His voice trembled only once, when he uttered the word forgiveness, pleading for a chance to face justice without blood vengeance. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had gathered, watching, waiting, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. Some held photos of lost loved ones, others whispered prayers, and some simply stared, unable to process the man before them. Rage and sorrow collided in the air, but he remained inside, standing for the truth he had finally surrendered to. The judge paused, surveying the courtroom. He spoke firmly, methodically, acknowledging the severity of the crimes and the confession that had laid bare the magnitude of betrayal and violence. The judge pronounced the sentence. Years in prison, the maximum allowed by law, to serve justice without inflaming the anger of those who had suffered. The courtroom seemed to exhale as the sentence was delivered. At the end of the day, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. No matter how long you run away from your past evil deed, the law will always catch up with you. Kindly like, comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more episodes.